Good day, and welcome to the All Souls Church of Sioux Falls, March 14th, 2021 worship service. We are able to have this virtual worship service because of the help of many. I thank our musicians, Carol Flower and Martin Radichev, for sharing their music with us. Pianist Carol has played for us several times in the past, whereas this is the first time that violinist Martin, a senior at Lincoln High School here in Sioux Falls, is playing for us. I also thank Paul Thompson for technical support, and I thank our speakers for their patience with the worship team as we continue to learn how to master new technologies. I now introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Peter Holland, who will be speaking to us, along with Greg Boris, in this service of remembrance, where we will remember those who have left us this past year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Both Peter and Greg are longtime members of our church.
Good morning. Welcome. My name's Peter Holland, and I am the coordinator of the service this morning. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you've been a member for a long time, you're welcome here. Whatever faith you have known or not known, or whatever your heritage, you are welcome here. Whatever questions you hold, whatever truths you seek, whatever sorrows you have known, whatever joy has filled your heart, whoever you are and whomever you love, you're welcome here. Our speakers today are Greg Boris and myself, and our theme is a memorial theme. This year, it's going to be based on the experiences we've had with COVID.
Thank you, Carol and Martin, for that lovely music. I will now light the chalice and read the words of our chalice lighting number 481 by Nancy Wood. It is our quiet time. We do not speak because the voices are within us. It is our quiet time. We do not walk because the earth is all within us. It is our quiet time. We do not dance because the music has lifted us to a place where the Spirit is. It is our quiet time. We rest with all of nature. We wake when the seven sisters awake. We greet them in the sky over the opening of the kiva. Please join in singing our first hymn. Now is the time when we ask for your help to do the work of our church through an offering. One half of our offerings are given to a local charity. The other half is used for our continuing operating expenses. During this time period, the board has chosen to give half of our collected offerings to the Banquet West here in Sioux Falls, where many of us have volunteered and continue to volunteer. The Banquet's mission is to provide a welcoming place where people in Sioux Falls can gather, receive nourishment, and experience love in action. Please use the Donate button on our church website or mail your check to the church. Please give generously. We will now hear Carol and Martin play Stanchen, a Little Serenade by Franz Schubert. I shall now say the words to receive the offering. Thank you for giving to All Souls Church. We give these gifts freely. We receive these gifts gratefully. We dedicate these gifts to the work of our congregation, serving human wholeness, caring for our planet, upholding religious freedom, welcoming the stranger, loving one another.
Our reading from today is a responsive reading, The Oversoul, by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells within us, and the sources of nature are in our own minds.
As there is no screen or ceiling between our heads and the infinite heavens, so there is no bar or wall in the soul where we, the effect, cease, and God, the cause, begins.
I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine.
There is deep power in which we exist, and whose beatitude is accessible to us.
Every moment when the individual feels invaded by it is memorable.
It comes to the lowly and simple. It comes to whosoever will put off what is foreign and proud. It comes as insight. It comes as serenity and grandeur.
The soul's health consists in the fullness of its reception.
Forever and ever, the influx of this better and more universal self is new and unsearchable.
Within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one.
When it breaks through our intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through our will, it is virtue. When it flows through our affections, it is love. So ends the reading. The people who we wish to remember in this service are people who have made a contribution to our society in general. There are also people that we want to remember who we have known personally. And so it is with those two themes in mind that we begin. There will be an opportunity afterwards to add your contributions. So let me start by mentioning two people from our congregation who died last year. And we've had memorial service for Mike Standing Soldier. Some of you would have been there. But for Tom Hoole, we haven't had a service. And Tom donated his body for science. And so his contribution after death continues in the University of South Dakota Medical School. The people that I selected for reference are people who have been known to many of us, some perhaps less so, but they in themselves represent some personal memories that you can bring to our discussion afterwards. To give you, for instance, my first person that I looked at among dozens of people who are famous who have died from COVID, the first one is John Prine, who was 73 years old and died on April the 7th. He was, as you may have known, a folk singer, and I remember him from Chicago when I was there in the late 60s, early 70s. His contribution as a folk singer was social commentary, and like many people who became famous in life, he started off in a way that was pretty ordinary. He was a mailman in Chicago and hailed from Maywood, one of the western suburbs. As he became famous, like a lot of people, he developed some idiosyncrasies. He collected Cadillacs. And one of the reasons why his death was so tragic in a way was that he was one of those people who had at least two underlying conditions. He'd had lung cancer, and that had been a very debilitating disease. My personal connection with him is through my wife, because John's marriage to Fiona Whelan was something that we in our family kind of talk about, because she was from the same county as Josephine. And if we think about what he achieved and what we remember him for in his music, I just want to highlight one of the songs that he sang. It was called Hello in There, and it was about getting old and lonely. And it was covered by several people, including Bette Midler. On a personal note, he had a reputation for being humorous and self-deprecating. And so, like a lot of people, he's somebody who you will probably have your own memories about. The second person I chose, just to highlight some of the contributions that people have made that have given joy to us, was a man called Nick Cordero. He was only 41 when he died on July the 7th, and he was a Canadian. He was a Broadway actor and singer, and there are several Broadway shows that he's acted in, but the one that I think stood out for me was one called Bullets Over Broadway. On March the 30th, he had pneumonia, and he was placed on a ventilator and given dialysis. And when he had a blood clot, his leg was amputated, and he was fitted with a trach tube. So his death is something that was really also pretty tragic and very difficult. He was somebody who had been nominated for Tony Awards for Best Feature in Feature Actor in Musical. And he was married to a woman called Amanda Klutz, who was a dancer. And they had just had a son in 2019. The third person that I'm thinking about was also in the public eye, and his death was fairly public because he had died after attending a Trump rally. Herman Cain, who was sometime a candidate for the presidency, was a black man who was the CEO of Godfather's Pizza. He opposed the wearing of face masks, but he was a man who had a master's in computer science, and though he had survived colon cancer in 2006, I suppose this made him vulnerable to COVID. And so he succumbed to it at age 74. He'd had a career in Coca-Cola, Pillsbury, Burger King, and Godfather's Pizza. So he was well known in the food industry, I suppose, not to mention the political scenario. And his achievement was to set up a PAC fund called Black Voices for Trump. And he was also part of a group which I think was a think tank called Americans for Prosperity. He'd had a controversial life, not just in the politics he chose, but also he had settled 2 complaints against him for sexual harassment, and those 2 complaints really ended his presidential ambitions. He was married to a woman called Gloria Etchison. They had 2 children and 4 grandchildren. So as a famous person, he was somebody who created both strong loyalties and also somebody who other people really couldn't stand. And I thought I'd mention him in the spirit of bringing some variety to the kinds of people who this disease has touched. Another person that that I consider is also a singer, Charlie Pride. He was 86 and died on December the 12th. And he had an interesting career in the sense that he was a pitcher in the old Black Baseball League. And he got his start in singing when it was discovered that he could sing, and he was invited to entertain the crowds before the baseball game began. And that began his career, which achieved 52 top 10 hits in the country music chart, 30 of which were number 1s. Because he was 86, he'd been drafted into the army, and he had worked in steel furnaces as a stoker. Unusually for a black man, he came from Helena, Montana, and they moved to Great Falls in '67 and finally to Texas, where he made contact with Chet Atkins, who launched his career. And I mention him as a black man because he once said that he was, first of all, billed as the first colored country singer, then as the first Negro country singer, then as the first black country singer, and finally as the first African American country singer. And one of the songs that he was well known for was called Kiss an Angel, Good Morning. So he married Rosine, his wife, in 1956. 2 sons, 1 daughter, 5 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, and they lived in Dallas.
Hi, I'm Greg Boris. A year ago, my wife Joan and I were returning from New Zealand and entering the new world of COVID. We'd heard rumblings about it when we were on our trip. Arriving back in Los Angeles, we saw nothing that previewed the stringent requirements now associated with air travel. Instead, it was the same herding of cattle through the immigration, with less than 0.1% of the people being masked up. In the ensuing weeks, we all came to know the names of people who died from COVID, starting with Li Wenliang, the ophthalmologist in Wuhan, who first alerted the public to the dangers of COVID. He was labeled a traitor to the state and persecuted. A few weeks later, he died at the age of 33. His alarm was then embraced by the Chinese government. The traitor was now a patriot. About the same time, Iran's deputy health minister coughed his way through a press conference on COVID, only to die of it a few days later. Since that time, over 500,000 people have died of COVID in the United States, and many more around the world. In my world of Sioux Falls education, 2 of my colleagues died of COVID. The first was Floyd Hunking. Floyd spent most of his career at Lincoln High as a counselor, and he also instituted the gifted education program there. The day after his death, I was bicycling home from work, and I saw one of Floyd's best friends raking his yard. And I stopped, as I often do, to say hi, and he looked particularly down. And he said, "I'm just really tired. My lawn raker is not here, and I have to do it all." And he sat down on the stoop, and we visited for a bit, and I bid him adieu. The next day, I saw Floyd's obituary, and I realized this guy was not down because he was raking leaves. It was because his best friend had died. Floyd died on November 2nd. The other person was a woman I worked with for some years in the school system as a school administrator, and that's Colleen B. Colleen was a principal at Edison, at Hawthorne, and several other places across the district. And she too died of COVID in February of this year. As people talk about COVID, some of the basic responses are such as masking and social distancing and washing your hands are being ignored because it's taking away our freedom or it's fake science. With these basic responses, you'd think it's not rocket science, but some people think it is. And it's with rocket science that I next turn. My cousin Ray was literally a rocket scientist. He was an aerospace engineer. That was his career until his recent retirement. He and his wife Diana had great plans, particularly to go to Ireland to see his alma mater, Notre Dame, play football this past fall. Well, COVID stopped that game. Ray grew up in Pittsburgh. I grew up in Chicago. And over the years, my family would go to Pittsburgh to see the relatives, including Ray and his family. They rarely came to Chicago because we had too many gangsters there. In fact, Ray's dad said that Ray should not visit us in Chicago when he went to Notre Dame because Ray's dad was afraid of the gangsters. But Ray went to Chicago anyway. He also traveled with the Notre Dame band, playing the sousaphone and experiencing Notre Dame bowl games. Being an aerospace engineer took Ray to Atlanta and Anaheim and finally to St. Louis, where he retired. He was the family member who looked after our Uncle Mike, who was living in Los Angeles and in his final years of his life. Over the years, Ray and I crossed paths and it usually was at a family member's funeral. There we caught up on our respective lives, and Ray was really getting into doing the family genealogy. And that mostly dealt with his mom's side, as opposed to his dad and my dad's side, because every time one of our father's relatives would come over, they would change their name to all sorts of things. In fact, Ray's last name is different than my last name. I spell Boris, B-O-R-I-S. He spells Boris, B-O-R-U-S. With retirement, the plan was for me to go to St. Louis, hang out with Ray and his wife Diana, do some genealogy. Well, COVID got in the way. Didn't travel down there this past year. In fact, it got in the way in more ways than one. In mid-January, both Ray and his wife Diana tested positive for COVID. This happened even though it appeared like they were doing everything they were supposed to be doing in terms of social distancing and masking and being isolated from everyone else. Nonetheless, they got COVID. Things rapidly took a turn for the worse, and the ultimate happened. On February 13th, his wife Diana died of COVID, and 3 days later, Ray died. Neither was aware of each other's condition as they struggled to survive on the ventilators. Their son, Pete, who's named after Ray's dad, encourages us all to get vaccines. He only wished it would have come sooner.
I will now extinguish the chalice. The chalice is extinguished, but the light goes with us out into the world. We will now listen to Carol and Martin one more time as they play Dvorak's Goin' Home, which is based on the Largo theme of his New World Symphony.